Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha. Now, recent events have raised some concerns and some questions in my mind, and I felt the topic serious enough to bring to your attention. The issue surrounds a role that I am more than a little familiar with myself, and that is the role of the game's critic. Now, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas behind what they expect from a critic when it comes to video games, so just to make sure we're on the same page, allow me to explain what I'm thinking and more what I'm concerned about so we can at least somewhat be on the same general level with each other. Now, a games critic is, of course, a person that critiques video games. That should be pretty self-evident. However, there are some vagaries involved, such as whether one relies solely on their impressions, whether they inject mechanical facts into their reviews or not, or even whether or not they make use of a point scoring system. But at the end of the day, critics all must rely on a combination of objective facts and their own experience and personal opinion in order to properly formulate a review. Now, I know that a lot of people can and will say that a critic's review must be objective, and I agree, to a point. Yes, a game's critic should remain as objective as possible, as the information being provided to the viewer or the reader is the majority of what matters, but one must never discount the subjective opinion. The critic disseminating this information to you has played a lot of games and has analyzed a great many as well. Their experience with a variety of game mechanics and a variety of game types affords them a perspective that can be very helpful, and as a result of that, I feel that their subjective opinion, assuming it is backed up by evidentiary fact, can be extremely useful. But when does one's subjective opinion go too far? When should one separate an aspect of the developers or even the publishers when it comes to whether or not one should purchase a game? You see, that is where many people will differ greatly in their opinion. Now, many people will hold to the belief that a game should be taken on its own merits entirely, regardless of publisher or developer or their actions at all. If it's a good game, then it's a good game, and that's all there is to it. Others will consider other aspects surrounding the game, such as its microtransactions, loot box monetization, cosmetics, enforced grind, or even the lack thereof, and still others consider the actions of the developers and the publishers in relation to the game. How do they respond to their customers? Do they treat them with respect, or do they ignore them? How do they handle monetization within the game? Do they actually listen to feedback, or do they merely claim to listen? And then there are others that go beyond even that. They will inject their own ideals into their determination. People who consider what social or political message a game is promoting, or whether or not a game is promoting a message that they want it to promote. And that is where I feel myself drawing up short in wary consideration. Now, take Far Cry 5, for example. It is a game that deals with the ideas of cults, specifically within the game a fictional cult known as Project at Eden's Gate. All of this plays out in a fictionalized Montana, which the developers did visit some areas of the real Montana in order to get a feel for the small town mentality and feel that one might expect. And from all reports, they managed to do rather well in many respects. However, many reviews have politicized and sometimes possibly over-politicized their reviews surrounding the game. Now, the game does have some links to the real world, such as the often talked about P-tape, which was an obvious reference to Trump. However, I'm concerned when I see reviews of a game that discuss a game's politics or perceived politics as much as the game itself. Now, take, for example, the Polygon review of the game by Ben Kuchera. Now, in that review, Kuchera stated, "It's a timely story that could at least try to address the polarized nature of current American politics or talk about the issues inherent in a country that seems to worship firearms. But I never saw anything that hinted at how these cultists were radicalized, and their ultimate goal, revealed at the end of the game, undercuts any grand statement." And it is that sentiment right there that makes me immediately start to dislike Ben Kuchera even more than I already did. Now, it's well known that Polygon is a very left-leaning site, but these forms of imposed social or political ideals and expectations within the form of a game review do little more than provide a disservice to gamers in general. No, the game didn't try to address the polarizing nature of American politics. Why? Because it is itself not intended to be a political game or one that even pushes a political narrative. That much has even been stated by the game's director, Dan Hay. The review itself, which I'll link down in the description, is littered with statements of utter exasperation at the game for not being more sensitive to the current social or political climate within the US, with statements like, The game totally fails to recognize the horror of shooting American drug addicts while the nation deals with a very real ongoing opioid crisis. Now, I know that a critic's subjective views surrounding a game are important for reasons I've previously stated, but this sort of thing is where I feel a line in the sand should be clearly drawn. The game is not political in the way Ben Kuchera and other games critics clearly expect it to be, and as a result of this, instead of critiquing the game based on its own story, which surrounds a cult, along with the game's graphics, mechanics, and stability, all I'm seeing left, right, and center is the concept of the non-existent political message within the game. To my mind, if a game includes a political message, then you can critique it based upon its politics. But is it fair to critique a game based upon its lack of politics? Now, some will draw the comparison that a games critic might more readily promote a game that also contains a lack of microtransactions, or a lack of additional save file capabilities, or a lack of an FOV slider in the case of certain British critics. However, those aspects rely on game features or a game's monetization, something that directly affects the game mechanics or the gamer's wallet, and by extension may also affect the game mechanics as well due to imposed grind. However, I see no instance within Far Cry 5 that its lack of a political statement affects the game's core mechanics or gameplay in any way, shape, or form. I see nowhere within Far Cry 5 where the lack of politicization imposes any form of grind or affects the gamer's ability or desire to spend additional money on microtransactions in any way. So what's left? Well, there is of course the story. While Far Cry 5, just like all of its predecessors, is an open world game, but also just like its predecessors, there is a game story that helps propel the player through the game and provide a loose form of direction and narrative progression within the game, as well as general focus for the game's overarching mechanics. But does the simple fact that a game's story fails to contain a politicization or social narrative that a critic espouses or feels should be promoted be enough to warrant its inclusion within the review or critique? Now again, I feel that goes back to whether or not the game is either actively or passively attempting to push a social or political narrative to begin with. And given that many are reporting on the fact that Far Cry 5 is generally apolitical, the game itself seems to wish to be no more than a Far Cry game whose story focuses on a dramatized and fictionalized backwoods Montana with a just as fictional yet realistic enough feeling cult. It sets out to feel just real enough to allow a certain believability. That allows the player to not have to rely too much on a suspension of disbelief while introducing enough other aspects to the game that it never feels too real for the player. So no, in this context, I really don't feel that it is at all appropriate to judge a fictional narrative within a video game because it doesn't promote a message that you want it to be promoting. Sometimes a rose is just a rose, and sometimes we should just let a game be a fucking game, for fuck's sake. Games are supposed to be fun. You remember when we played games for enjoyment? When we played games to unwind after the stresses of dealing with school or dealing with work, or when we just wanted to play a game to experience a really good story and interact with characters we came to care about because they were just that good, or because it was a game that just felt really great to play and you happened to be really good at it. Remember when that was a thing? I haven't forgotten, and to be honest, neither should you, but it seems like in this day and age, in the current social and political climate, that there are people out there like Ben Kuchera who do seem to be forgetting that. And that really should not happen. And by their forgetting that, by their injecting their own social narrative, their own political ideals onto their review, onto their critique, onto a formulation of an opinion that is supposed to instruct and inform and provide information to the gaming community for gamers to be able to make a better informed decision on whether or not they want to buy a game to begin with. No, that is an extreme disservice to all of you, and it should not be allowed. But as always, please do feel free to let me know what you think down in the comments below. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.